Hello. Today we welcome Paula Avila and Elida Caballero Cabrera to Arizona to talk to us about their important work in Colombia, Argentina, and most recently in Mexico. They are working to secure reproductive rights for women as a part of their work globally with the Women's Equality Center. On behalf of the Arizona List Board, staff, and members, welcome to Paula and Elida. We're happy to have you here in Arizona.
Oh my God, how inspiring was to see that video. So before we even start, I just have to say that I teared up a few times to see how many women have been elected in all offices here in Arizona. So thank you so much for the work that you do for women. It really means a lot. My name is Paula Avila-Guillen. I am the Executive Director at the Women's Equality Center. I am an immigrant originally from Colombia who now lives in the United States, and I am one of the leaders of the Green Wave, and we will talk more about that.
Good morning, Tucson. How are you? This is so inspiring. I want to hear you clap again for yourselves. This is amazing, so inspiring. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We need to replicate this everywhere. My name is Elida Caballero Cabrera, one of the senior directors at the Women's Equality Center as well, also an immigrant from Panama, living in Washington, D.C. But I spend 75% of my time in Latin America, and we'll share a little bit of what we do. But I'm very honored. I'm very proud of everything what you're doing here. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
So practically for the last 14 years of our lives, we have been working on reproductive rights and reproductive justice across Latin America. And we never thought that we will have to, we were doing in this dual capacity, living here in the United States, but spending like 50 to 70% of our time in Latin America. And I think we never thought that we will have to bring this fight home, right here. But here we are. And when the day that the decision got leaked, just a few weeks after the decision, we actually were in a legislative trip to Mexico where Representative Stephanie Hamilton was with us. And it was so powerful to see that exchange and to recognize the solidarity across borders. And one of the first tasks that we put to each other when we arrived, when we knew what was happening with doves, was we need to bring the green wave to the United States. So I'm going to first explain a little bit of what is the green wave and tell you a little bit of how we have been able to achieve success in Latin America in the last 2.5 years in something they thought that was impossible. And what can that lesson be learned and could help us as we have to reshape the landscapes of reproductive justice in the United States. So the green wave, you might have seen some of these handkerchiefs that we had outside. The green wave is started with a symbol, right? And it was this handkerchief. Originally in Argentina, the idea of using the handkerchief came from the mothers of Las Plaza de Mayo. They were the women who lost their children during the Argentinian dictatorship. Because they couldn't protest, because they were under dictatorship, they will use these handkerchiefs around her head, originally being white, the handkerchiefs. And when La Campaña Nacional por el Aborto Legal, Seguro y Gratuito, which was the coalition of organizations that started fighting for abortion rights in Argentina, decided that they needed a symbol, they took the handkerchief as a symbol of resistance, but they decided to make it green, because green is life and green is health, and abortion is both of those things. It's life and healthcare. And they started organizing around Argentina, and they started mobilizing. And initially, they decided that every Tuesday they were going to march and they were going to have at least one symbolic action. Every Tuesday was the day of bringing the handkerchiefs out, the pañuelos. Sometimes there were 10 women. Sometimes there were millions. Sometimes there were 3 cities. Sometimes there was every single city in Argentina. They had a group of women, even in front of the courthouses, in front of Congress. Sometimes in those cities, there were larger groups, sometimes smaller. It didn't matter. What it mattered was the consistency of doing this every Tuesday, because it was sending a very clear message. And the message is, we are not going to go away until you give us our rights. And that was so inspiring. In February, actually, of 2020, just a few weeks, the world was about to collapse with the pandemic. I had the privilege of being in Buenos Aires, Argentina. And so one of the largest marches there has been for abortion rights in Latin America. There was probably over 2 million people marching. And there was something that was beautiful about that march, and it was how this was a march of multiple generations. You will see grandmothers with grandchildren. It was also a march of happiness. Everybody was happy. People were protesting, but they were happy. They were excited because they were fighting for something that they believe on, and they believed that they were in the right side of history. At the end of that year, in December of 2020, Argentina changed its abortion laws. And it liberalized abortion. But what they didn't know at that time is that they had created a movement that passed national borders. What started as something very local effort, it became a transnational movement. A few months after Argentina passed its abortion laws, Mexico did some magic.
Yes. So, as Paula was mentioning, this green wave started to come to every country in Latin America. And it was just so powerful to feel inspired by these marches. And again, sometimes we're 10 people, sometimes we're hundreds. I think never as many as in Argentina until recent years, also in Mexico. But it was just very inspiring to see people claiming for their rights. We had an amazing decision from the Supreme Court of Mexico in 2021, September, actually, almost 1 year after Argentina. And it says that it was unconstitutional to send a woman to jail for getting an abortion. And that was, yes. And that was an amazing victory because it allowed the decision that was already made in 2007 in Mexico City to expand abortion rights in the rest of the state. Also, let's remember, Mexico is like the United States. So many different states and all have, the federal level and the state level. After that decision in 2021, currently, Mexico has 11 states where abortion is allowed and it's legalized. And it just kept happening organically. We were actually working on campaigns with our partners in Mexico, like, okay, what's the next state? And what's the next state? And within a couple weeks, when we were supposed to be working on that state approved or passed legislation legalizing abortion. Yes, a round of applause for Mexico. It's just been amazing. But I think one of the biggest things that pushed for this was mobilization. We were seeing mobilizations everywhere in Mexico. Mexico City, Oaxaca, Quintana Roo, Sinaloa, Hidalgo. Every city was just doing so much mobilization and having the green wave everywhere, talking to people. And, every state was different in the way you approach, their government officials and you approach legislature. But the partners and the activists have been so smart in catering and tailoring messaging for every one single of those. And for me, it was even more inspiring because we know Mexico is a very religious Catholic country. And then people realize that this is not colliding. This is not, against your beliefs. That you can be a religious person, but also you can be an abortion supporter. Because as my mother, which is very religious and Catholic, says, my Lord, my religion is a religion of love, and I give love to everyone. And I think that was something very beautiful that we saw, our partners from Catholics for Choice in Mexico, for example, tailoring all this key messaging for members of Congress, legislators, policymakers. And I think one of the biggest messages that this battle in Mexico left me with, and the inspiration that we have used in other countries that hopefully we can get to talk to you about, was that we need to meet people where they are. We cannot be measuring how progressive you are, how feminist you are, how pro-choice you are. We have just to take everyone and try to meet them where they are, because we need all the support that we can have. The other side is not measuring how facious you are. You are 5% facious, I'll get you to 50 by the end of the year. And we cannot allow that to happen to us. Sometimes there are conversations that are very hard for us to have, but that's why we have such an amazing group of women, or friends, of allies that can also handle those hard conversations where we need to have them, and be a better messenger for that person that might be key for some changes that we need. And then going around the continent, after that amazing decision in Mexico, something even more awesome happened in Colombia.
So the green wave keeps growing, and we saw the expansion in Mexico, and that had already inspired a movement in Colombia. And in February 2022, last year, the Constitutional Court of Colombia expanded abortion access to allow abortion up to 24 weeks of pregnancy, and then after that, an exception system with no limitation limits. This is the most progressive law in all of Latin America. Yes. It also mandates the government to pay for abortions, to provide them in the state and in state hospitals, and for insurance companies to pay for abortions, because abortions are healthcare. So for the last 2.5 years, we have seen very Catholic and very conservative countries in many ways change abortion rights in Latin America. Argentina, Mexico, and Colombia in 2.5 years. This is not the result of magic. It is not the result of one day, the court decided that, yes, you know what, it's the moment to legalize. No, this is the result of hard work. Hard work that started like this. They started by electing the right people in office, from judges to state legislators, from governors through Congress, in every part of the way. And it started with a movement that believed in the long-term strategy. None of these issues, none of these countries use one unique strategy to fight. It was not only legal or political. It was legal, political, streets, communications, narrative, because it was the combination of multiple strategies what really help us to be able to attack this issue in multiple angles. There is also the work of data. And I think that this is something that, as the United States enters into a different phase in which it's going backwards, is going to be very, very important for future fights. During the last 10 years in Latin America, we have been collecting public health data to be able to give arguments of what are the real consequences of total abortion bans. But let me be clear. We all know that the laws to ban abortions are not about abortion, right? Like, it have nothing to do with abortion. It has everything with control. It's all about trying to control our bodies, make decisions for us, because they believe that if we are giving the freedom, we are going to abuse that freedom. Because that's how they see us, as citizens that don't have fully capacity to make our own decisions of our own bodies. So anybody who tries to control us, right, they do it because they want to impose a way of being and a way of seeing. So these laws are about control. But these laws have really, really hard, these bans have really, really hard consequences on people. And during the years, we were able to capture some of those consequences through the use of data. And we were able to prove the countries that have bans on abortion or highly restrictive abortion laws, immediately you start seeing a spike on maternal mortality and in maternal morbidity. And the data was there. There was nothing that you could do about it. That was a key argument in Argentina to legalize, because for them, it stopped being an issue of choice and it became an issue of public health. Argentina, by the way, also includes the abortion services should be provided in public hospitals and be paid by governments, which I think is fascinating to see that happening in Latin America. And part of the reason why this data was so important is because I allowed those who were maybe on the fence to understood this from a different lens, and it was from the public health perspective. That was a very important argument. A second argument that was very important in the case of Colombia was the case of criminalization. So one of the consequences of total abortion bans, as we saw, was high rates of maternal mortality, high rates of maternal morbidity. But the second biggest consequence is criminalization. Criminalization, especially of young girls and of women who are in very vulnerable circumstances, specifically poor women who are of low socioeconomic status. This was also really key during the Colombia fight, to be able to prove that at the end of the day, the people who are being criminalized belong specifically to certain specific categories, such as being young women. Over the 400 people who have been criminalized in the last year, all of them were under 25 years old. And we use a lot of the arguments of criminalization because of our own experience working in El Salvador. El Salvador is a country that for the last 20 years had a total abortion ban. They not always had it. They used to have an exception system. They at least allow some type of abortions. But in a very swift move of conservatives, El Salvador became a country with a total abortion ban. 2 years after that, you start seeing a high rate of criminalization of women. But the women who were getting criminalized, they were not getting criminalized because of abortion. They were getting criminalized because of miscarriages and stillbirths, because they were not able to prove the moment that they arrived to a hospital that the reason why they were bleeding, it was because of miscarriage, because they didn't have the perfect story to tell, because they were in the middle of shock, because they were in hemorrhage, and they end up being sentenced to 30 to 40 years in prison. Elida and I have been working for many years to free these women. Now we can happily say almost all of them are free.
70 women.
70 women.
70.
70 women have been free because of this work. But those are the consequences that sometimes people don't see about passing these restrictions. They think it's easy to just pass this law, but they have consequences in real people. So public health, criminalization were key arguments to have this issue. In Mexico, there was another argument that was super key for change the laws.
Yes, and just to add on something what Paula was mentioning about, before I forget, when the law passed in Argentina, they still have the Argentinian Pope. So again, a very Catholic religious country that was able to move forward, even though they have a big person trying to fight against it. But also going back a little bit before I jump into Mexico again, in El Salvador, I think that one of the biggest, impacts for me was not only that this was crazy, that women were sent to jail for 40 years for having a miscarriage or an obstetric emergency, but also that even though this is a very conservative religious country as well, no one wanted to see women in jail. People did not want to see their spouses, their mothers, to being sentenced to jail for 40 years or to die because of an obstetric emergency, because we also had cases of women who died for not having the right access to health. So I think that those were key, also collected with data that told us that no one wanted to see criminalized women or dead women. And also another key from data that I wanted to add up to what Paula mentioned is that the argument that as a public official or as a candidate, that you will lose your seat or you will lose votes because of being pro-abortion, it's a lie. We have so many legislators in Argentina which tailor amazingly their personal beliefs in their speeches, but also telling, I'm a very religious person and I do not like abortion, but I have to legislate for everyone. And a lot of people that were directly and freely pro-abortion that got reelected over time again and again and again. And we have seen that also in Colombia and also in Mexico. And I think that's a way to scare our amazing leaders in office, but it's a lie. We have seen it with data that this is a lie. And going back to Mexico a little bit, was one of the key premises of the decision was social economic status, that women needed to access abortion because everyone who was accessing was only a small group of privileged women that could travel, to Mexico City to get the services. And that was another key factor in there because, and that is amazing because it amplifies the alcance, the reach of the law, the reach of the law, but also it highlights the importance of having these across all sectors in society. And I think that's a very important, it's a beautiful resolution. It was written by a male who became actually the former Supreme Court president, became such an activist and supporter of abortion that it was really good to see a white male, middle 60, just being on his TikTok saying like, are you pro-abortion? Let me tell you about abortion. And the way he started reaching out to people, which is another key thing you need, that I mentioned before, you need to find the messenger for your audience, but he started reaching out to people that never were in this fight before. So those things are very important because we just keep adding allies and everything. And then I couldn't stop talking today without telling you about Honduras. Honduras is one of the hardest countries I've ever worked in, but it's one of the most closer to my heart. Honduras has a total ban on abortion, and it also had a total ban on emergency contraception. Even though Honduras is one of the most violent countries to be a woman, it's one of the countries with the most highest rates of sexual violence and deaths on women. And after 13 years, just on March 8th, last Wednesday, then the first female president of the country lifted total ban on emergency contraception in Honduras. And this is such an amazing fight that our partners have been fighting for the last 13 years, not only fighting for their rights of emergency contraception access, but under a dictatorship that put their lives in risk every time they went out and they, march and they protest, and they still went out and they still did it and they still had hope, and it finally happened. And I know, and I mentioned this because first is something that we thought it will be way too far away from the United States. And now looking at the news on some states, I'm like, wait, what? What is happening here? So we never talk about Honduras as a success story because we never had a success. In the 8 years that I've been working in Honduras, it was just, we did everything we could. But now I think it's a very inspirational place that had all the harshest environment to work. And this group of women and activists just were able to make this happen, and they want more now. So I think it's a good example of places that is really hard, and you might be disheartened or disencouraged to keep fighting. But when you feel that way, remember Honduras, that it's one of the hardest places to work on, and they still got something done.
And the green wave has now arrived in the United States. And the green wave is this movement, this idea of believing that change is possible. 2 weeks ago, we had the first encounter between Latin American activists and activists from the United States. It was called the Green Wave Gathering of Las Americas. And one of the first things that happened is that we were able to recognize each other as equal. These type of convenings had been happening on the other side for years. The other side had always seen their tactics as a global movement. We were the only ones who were still thinking that each country, each region is separate. And it was really powerful to understand that, number one, our enemy is the same from Argentina to Seattle. It's a patriarchal system that's trying to oppress us. That is the enemy. Number two, our fights and our struggles are similar, but that we as a movement can really be so much stronger when we share lessons, when we share tactics. And the powerful message that was sent with over 100 activists in Washington, D.C., is that if we are united, if we work together, we are able to overcome everything. The main message of the Green Wave for me is always a message of hope, because this is not the short-term fight. This is the long-term fight. This is not going to be fixed with one election cycle or with one grant cycle, but each little grant cycle, each little election cycle, we get closer as long as we keep fighting. There is never something that is too small. And that has been one of the most beautiful lessons I have learned from some of the most resilient activists. When you think that your event is too small, that your conversation is too small, that maybe it's not important, just think what happens if everybody around the country, around the states, will do that little small thing. We all put a little grain of arena, of sand, into a big sea. And that is the power of resistance. When you are fighting for the long-term wrong, when you are fighting for your life, for your future, when you are fighting for your right to decide who you want to be as a human, you need to resist. And the best way to resist is hope, because hope becomes change. When we believe that we can create change, we fight, and we march, and we volunteer, and we show up, and we elect the right people in office, and we remind those that we elect why we elect them. That is very important too. So I think that just to allow time for questions and just to end this, for us that we have been living these dual lives between the United States and Latin America, it's really beautiful and inspiring to see that we now from this side, from the north, are looking south to learn lessons. And it's an honor for us to share those lessons, because we have seen how hard the reality can be when you have total abortion bans, when you have highly restricted abortion bans. We have seen how devastated it is for women and girls, how devastated it is for families. So we are here to fight and to say no more to those bans.